Tonight's panel is a discussion on different approaches to the abstract photographic experience. Our panelists are artists Susan Rankaitis and James Welling, and UCLA art history professor George Baker, and moderated by Lyle Rexer. Lyle's the author of this gorgeous new book published by Aperture, The Edge of Vision, The Rise of Abstraction in Photography, which he will be signing after tonight's program in our bookstore upstairs. Lyle writes about art and art history for several magazines and journals, and in addition to this new book, he's also written the book Photography's Antiquarian Avant-Garde, The New Wave in Old Processes. Lyle also teaches undergraduate and graduate students at School of Visual Arts in New York. And tonight he's going to give us kind of a brief art history lesson about the use of abstraction in photography since its inception. And then he's going to present us with a thesis which I kind of secretly hope is going to set up a debate with George Baker and possibly our artists. So we'll see what happens. Please join me in welcoming Lyle Rexer, Jim Welling, Susan Rankaitis, and George Baker.
I'd like to introduce, first of all, my panelists who are, I think, still wondering why I dragged them up on stage. But on my immediate left is Susan Rankaitis. And Susan is the Fletcher Jones Chair in Art at Scripps College, which is down the road a piece. And she's obviously a working artist, and she shows with Robert Mann Gallery in New York. Further on my left is Jim Welling, who is a professor in the Department of Art at UCLA. And he shows in Los Angeles with Reagan projects, and also in New York with David Zwerner, correct? Mm-hmm. And finally, far on my left in the shadows is George Baker, who is an associate professor in the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art at UCLA, and he is one of the editors of October magazine. I've invited them to talk with me about the subject you see on screen, which is the project I've just completed called The Edge of Vision. And before we get started, I want to say just a couple of things. I have to thank a couple of people before I get going. First, I want to thank the Hammer for having us here and for inviting all of you here. I think it's a wonderful luxury to have an institution like the Hammer with its public programming. Second, I want to thank the Andy Warhol Foundation, Creative Capital, and the Arts Writers Grant Program. I just want to say briefly that the people who are sitting next to me are all associated with institutions of higher learning. I am not. That's my disclaimer. Although I do teach at the School of Visual Arts, I am not a tenured professor. And I am, technically speaking, an independent scholar. I suppose that would be my designation, and the more pejorative version would be journalist. The disadvantage of that is that when it comes time to do a book like The Edge of Vision, there is virtually no money out there available for people like me. And Creative Capital, under the aegis of the Andy Warhol Foundation, is one of the few places that will fund a project like this from the writing side. So I have to really, I owe them a tremendous debt of gratitude for the help that they gave me in this project. And finally, I just want to thank the Aperture Foundation, which is the publisher of this work and is also the venue for the exhibition that grows out of it. I'm not going to go into a sort of a long rap about Aperture at this point, except to say that there's nothing like it in the United States right now. And it is one of those endangered species that does support projects like this and people like me. So again, I owe Aperture an enormous debt of gratitude. What I'd like to talk about just for a few minutes and then open it up to a discussion with our panelists, who are much more interesting than I am, is to try to set a scene for you, or give you a little bit of background about how this project came together for me, or the sorts of things that were interesting to me that got me thinking about abstraction in photography. And I should say a couple of things right off the bat, and I think you'll see as we go on very clearly. First of all, the fact that I'm interested in abstraction in photography, or something what we call abstract photography, doesn't imply that I think, first of all, that there is such a thing as abstract photography. I think we'll see that, in fact, the idea of abstraction in photography is important importantly woven into the fabric of the medium. The other thing I would say is that it's not prejudicial against other forms of, let's call them representational works in photography, and we'll see that very clearly as well. So I'm not a partisan here to argue for a position, but I am here to show, or at least to talk a little bit about some preoccupations of mine and some of the things that I've, in a sense, turned up as the course of this project has gone along. I think what motivated this primarily was I asked myself a question, and it's a question that I will keep coming back to as we go along for all the panelists, and that is I was seeing something very unusual in the photographers that I was interested in that surprised me, and I wanted to know what sanctioned such a thing. And it can be summed up by a couple of images by Thomas Struth. First, this one, which is a deadpan portrait, and then this picture, which is from a more recent series called JPEGs, which are heavily pixelated images that he takes from the internet and then works in certain ways. And I was also seeing something like this, which is almost a snapshot, a kind of sentimental snapshot by Wolfgang Tillmans that was being paired in exhibitions with pieces like this, also a Tillmans. Much more difficult to read, or at least superficially much less familiar. And this is another Tillmans, which is a take on a very untraditional take on a kind of sentimental floral or landscape image. I was also seeing images like this by James Welling, which I thought I understood, or it seemed to me, and this is from the 80s, I believe, from the early 80s, was a kind of a joke about photography, but nevertheless a fairly straightforward one. At least that's what I thought. And then other images like this, where it was much more difficult to understand precisely what the trajectory of Jim Welling's work was, and what precisely, at least for me, someone who was sort of reared in more traditional approaches to photography, just what exactly it was he thought he was doing. There were other people who were also, I think, equally challenging. This is a series of pictures by Hiroshi Sugimoto of wax figures, in a sense, a sort of, you know, how shall I say, a sort of strategy of bringing the very dead back to life and then killing them again. And a more recent set of pictures, which were equally surprising to me. These are shadow pictures which he took in his apartment in Tokyo. And I had a conversation with him at one point where I asked him what he was up to, and he said he was building a house. And I said, well, that's great. What are you going to do in the house? I mean, it's going to be a new house. And he said, I'm building it just to take pictures in. And this is essentially, this is what grew out of that sequence. And then there were other artists who were doing, they were joining what were, strike me as very traditional kinds of photographic images, or almost traditional images, and other, how shall I say, more distancing strategies. This is Roland Fischer, a German photographer. This is from the sort of Chinese pool series. And this is also Roland Fischer, and these are building facades, which he's particularly hooked on. There were other approaches to photography that were coming into my view as I was working on this book that were the sorts of images that, well, I hadn't seen sanctioned before. That is to say, they did not seem to have a clear precedent, although I think we'll have a chance to look back and maybe see that they did a little bit. This is a picture by Atta Kim, which is really a kind of palimpsest picture. It's the sex act, which takes place in long exposure over a long period of time. And even relatively straightforward or apparently straightforward images like this picture by Stephen Shore, thank you. We're doing very, very peculiar things with our expectations about certain basic photographic facts. And I just want to draw your attention to what happens to the vanishing point perspective when it gets confused by a variety of other kinds of, how should we say, geometries and visual energies in a picture like this. So we can see that, that photography was at least from my perspective, was something that was very much in transformation, that many of the assumptions about photography were being poked at, or they were being re-examined, or they were being rediscussed, or they were being reimagined. And that had been going on for really quite a while. In fact, I suppose if we look back at the history of photography, we'll find that it had been going on since the beginning of photography. But there were notable points, people like Mel Bachner, who in the 60s had a very brief but very productive flirtation with photography as a way of finding out or understanding what it was that people did and what they expected of photographs. And these are pictures of just stuff that he took pictures of, and they were the culmination of a long process of investigation to understand exactly what we thought we were getting out of pictures and what kind of information we really expected from them. Then there are people who are from our bailiwick, Walid Beshti, who is from Los Angeles. And Walid is, in a sense, taking pictures that he would argue are what you see is what you get, that there's really nothing behind this except precisely what he tells you, which is perhaps crumpled up paper and light, or perhaps less than that. And there were other people like Marco Breuer, who is, I think, one of the more interesting characters, who don't even make photographs at all. They make objects that begin with photographic paper and are developed as photographs, but in fact are nothing more than records of physical assaults on the support of the photograph. And what's remarkable, I think, about a picture like this is that it looks like, very much when you see it, like a picture of something, but it is in fact a three-dimensional object that registers a particular attack on the surface of the paper. So this one has been raked over, probably. I'm not sure exactly what the technique he uses, but he's done everything from shoot things with shotgun pellets to light matches to them, all in the sense to, you might say, open up the photographic surface, or to widen our sense of precisely what inheres in the surface itself, its artifactual quality. And as I draw kind of to the end of my list of these preliminaries, this is a photographer named Roger Newton, who I became very interested in because he focuses in particular on the lens. And for him, the lens is the mediating device, the key device in a kind of photographic seeing. And he's been investigating all manner of different refractive devices through which we might be able to make a photograph. This is done with a diamond lens that he ground himself, but he's also used things like cow eyes, he used olive oil, he's used all kinds of media through which he wants to, in a sense, sort of, how shall I say, re-experience or rethink the relationship between our seeing and the objects of photography that are supposedly being transparently mediated by a lens. And I was also interested, as many people have been, by things outside of photography. This is a painting by Gerhard Richter, which has as much to say about photography and about where we are in terms of sort of the status of the photograph as any photograph that we might see. And another work by Vija Selmans, I'm probably not pronouncing her name correctly, but someone else who is particularly interested in an aspect of the almost photograph. This is in fact a print that looks for all the world like the kind of image that a photograph might make, but is in fact her own, you might say, parallel to a photograph. And this notion of parallelism, particularly as it's associated with science, is one that I think is going to come up in both Susan's work and in Jim Welling's work. They both these artists have an intense interest, although I think calibrated slightly differently, in the fact that we, you might say, are a sort of science-obsessed age, and we have been for a very long time, certainly since the birth of photography itself. Then there were a few things like students of mine at the School of Visual Arts, and this is by Seth Lambert, who was a student of mine, And it's simply a set of artifacts that were left on the bed of a scanner that he scanned. And then, because it was a digital image, he proceeded to grid out. And it can be blown up and expanded almost infinitely. It can also be shrunk down. And somehow the data remains the same, and yet what it's telling us about the notion of the order that a photograph might contain is for him, it's very exciting. It's also very implicitly chaotic. And one of his teachers at the School of Visual Arts was Penelope Imbrico, who was doing a kind of canvas of the internet, looking for photographs in which suns appeared. And she was actually on the Flickr, on the photo sharing site. And she began to harvest images that were tagged for sunsets. And what she found were millions and millions of images, which she gathered and then printed out in small 4x5 images, and she could expand and contract the exhibition of these suns to almost any size. And we've seen wall-size installations that have been 30 or 40 feet long. We've seen small selections that she's made. And all these, I think her work, all this work testifies, I think, to a particularly fertile period in photography. One in which, and I think that George Baker has said this before, in which very clearly photography is in a kind of state of transformation, and really the question is, what is being transformed? That is, what are we going to come out on the other side with? And I was going to do a quick pass through the early history of, you might say, of abstraction, but I'm not going to do that, because it follows a kind of line that we know pretty well, at least from our art history courses, where we move toward a kind of vanishing of the subject, or a kind of emptying out almost of the traditional subjects of painting. And I use painting as a model here, but this was the model that I followed in thinking about photography, and there were other kinds of injections or modulations of this. Let's call it a teleology or a progress, and this is a painting by Pollock, which injects other kinds of issues into the field of painting, but nevertheless is vacating the traditional image or the traditional content of the painting. And it ends up with a picture like this by Ad Reinhardt, which is one of his very loquacious black paintings. And I wanted to interrupt here. One of the things about painting is that painting has lots and lots of last paintings, and this has been going on since the 300 AD. And I wanted to ask George Baker and see if he would jump in here. There's a lot of last paintings, but there are no last photographs. And there are a lot of first photographs, but there are no first paintings. So, I was wondering about that, because this is our first photograph. Okay, this is one of the candidates for our first photograph. This is a photograph by Fox Talbot. And again, I mean, I don't want to sort of stop the flow here, because I want to get through this relatively more briefly than I have done. But I wonder, George, and I was meaning to ask you this since I was reading your work, is why are there no last photographs?
I thought there were. I thought
well, I mean, in a sense, that's what I wanted to find out from you. I mean,
yeah, I thought the last photograph was in 1999 or so. But I mean, I'm sorry, I'm joking. But
no, not at all.
No, but I mean, there's experiences of last photographs that are tied to just the technological nature of the medium. I mean, how many stories I've been told by friends who are artists who work in photography of having their stock, disappear, or they become collectors and fetishists of things that are no longer produced technically in the last decade and a half in the transition to digitalization.
Right.
So there's that aspect, but in terms of what you're talking about, like a rhetoric of images.
Yes, in the rhetoric of images, that's what I'm talking about. Anyway, so let's jump back to this first photograph. What moved me, in a sense, through these questions about photography that I was seeing in the contemporary artists that interested me a great deal, was to go back and take a quick look at some of the early history of photography. And I had an aha moment at the George Eastman house when I saw a picture very much like this, although it may have been at the Met, actually. Anyway, the photographs were hooded. and they were very sensitive to the light that originally brought them into being, so that if they were exposed too often, they'd be destroyed and they'd disappear completely. And I'd been looking at a lot of modernist work, which didn't interest me very much. I mean, it was very earnest, and it was very, a lot of it was very political, but not very interesting to me. And I opened the hood on an image very much like this, and I saw a very different idea about photography. It was maybe a little bit like when a scientist gets to look in a telescope and look back at a star that's already dead, but its light is still reaching us. But this was a little different. What it showed me, and this image as well, which is a mousetrap photograph by Fox Talbot, and maybe these images also by Fox Talbot, which were sort of tests that he was doing, was that photography from its inception was a much more ambiguous kind of medium than we tended to give it credit for, and that very much, one of the problems was the terms in which we had been discussing it since its inception, or the confusions of terms that we had been discussing it. And there'd been lots of talk about its indexical character and its relationship, its umbilical relationship to the world, or its necessary relationship to the world. But what I was seeing in these early images was something much more fugitive and a lot more tentative. And it wasn't just a matter of printmaking. It struck me that the world photographed, the world seen through a photograph, was problematic right from the beginning. And my notion of abstraction, which I'd seen developing in the artists that I'd been intrigued by, was in fact, at least on its face value, intrinsic or inherent to photography. And it's something that George as well has written about in the past, which is that, photography is an abstracting medium right from the get-go, and for reasons that are obvious, that it carves out something out of the flow of time, or that it puts a box around it, or it does things that make the image, in a sense, decontextualized, something that exists at least as much in the mind as it does, in a sense, in reality. And all those sort of aspects of photography struck me with enormous force, and it said, it's really time to go back and look not only at the history of photography yet again, but at contemporary photographers who have been poking very much at these issues, who have said to themselves that, the assumptions about photography have to be re-examined, not just because we want to look at photography, but because photography is a medium of compelling interest, and we, as artists, want to understand what it does and where it sits today in the horizon of sort of image making, or in the possibilities for making an image. And again, some of this may come out of the fact that, as George says, that there aren't any photographs anymore. So in a sense, it's kind of a memorial project. That is to say, when
I was joking. I really didn't say that.
Yes, but I've taken this seriously. I remember I was at a Society for Photographic Education conference when Dave Hickey was speaking, the critic, and he started out the conference by announcing, he said to the crowd, well, now that chemical photography is dead, and the crowd, which was loaded with lots of chemical photographers at the time, visibly blanched, several left the room at that moment. But I think we can say with some confidence that the notion of chemical photography, or the notion of photography perhaps per se, is very much a kind of an antiquarian term, or rapidly becoming an antiquarian term. So that may well have motivated my thinking, or my interest, to go back and look again at this medium, to see, in a sense, how it was going to make a transition out of its, you might say, its more traditional, or its more general assumptions about it. Anyway, and that leads me to some images by our panelist. James Welling was, again, when I first started to look at his work, and I can say this now in all honesty, James' work struck me, he struck me as, you might say, the Bustos Domecq of contemporary photography. And Bustos de Mec, for those of you who don't know, is a character from Borges who is a very equivocal figure. He is someone who comments on a series of completely crackpot schemes, which he takes absolutely at their face value. And by arguing for them, and they include everything from plagiarism to, I can't think of all the kind of intellectual and artistic schemes that he justifies. But in the very act of justifying, forces us to look again at precisely the assumptions we made about what is a work of art, about whether, in fact, who consumes a work of art, is there such a thing at all? And when I mean, it's all done in a joking manner because it's, in a sense, because it's Borges, but looking at Welling's photographs like this one, which we see up on the screen, and can you tell me what the title of this one is, Jim? Because I can't remember.
It's called Island.
It's called Island. And I was thinking to myself, someone who would make a photograph like this and call it Island has clearly got a very, how shall I say, different idea about what constitutes photographic meaning, about the role of a title in photography, about precisely what our expectations are of an image than I was used to. And it moved on through a series of images where I began to change my sense of Welling, and he started, or he does now, begin to me to seem much more like Fox Talbot. That is to say, someone who is constantly curious about precisely what photographs do, about what the world looks like when it's photographed, about the sorts of things that might appear through a photograph or because of a photograph, and certainly about the way we interpret them, the way we care about them, and the way we, in a sense, talk about them. And all those things are constantly in play with Jim's images. And the more that I've looked at these, and this is sort of confession of mine, the more, in a sense, I can't see anyone else's, because he seems to have asked, at least from my perspective, all the necessary questions, or shown us so many of the necessary things about what this kind of image making might entail now. And I just wanted to run through just quickly just a few more of these images. And I think you can see that we're engaged with somebody whose imagination is very fertile and who picks his subjects never arbitrarily. Now, he might not be able to explain why he picks the subjects he picks, but I think it's in those choices, more than almost anything else, more than process, more than anything he might do in the darkroom, or it's in the subjects that he picks and the way he imagines them that he opens up these doorways that about aspects about photography that everything that we may have taken for granted is back on the table. So as you can see, this is from a series called Light Sources, and this is from a series called New Abstractions, and this is from the...
It's a term I made up called degradés.
Degradés, yes. And as my understanding, James, is these are all made without a camera in the...
They're just photograms.
They're
Shadows.
photograms. They're essentially shadows, and different from Sugimoto's shadows in his apartment. But essentially, nothing more than the registration of a light, of light's impedance. And in a sense, recalling, the fundamental nature of not only photography, but I would say perhaps all image making, or our ability to see images. And then things that I absolutely love and that recall for me not only 19th century photography, but also something that I want to talk to you both about, and that is your interest in science. Because this looks, on the one hand, like a torso. It looks like a photogram, let's say, by Anna Atkins from the 19th century of a piece of seaweed. She often did a whole series of cyanotypes of seaweed, and cyanotypes always print blue. And it also looks like a computer-generated image that is giving us a description of some sort of mathematical phenomenon, slightly irregular. But in a sense, what it looks like is the generation of a computer model. And then, of course, the more recent work, which is the photograms of flowers, which on the one hand hark back to, again, the earliest kind of botanical photographs, where you just put a blossom on a piece of photo paper, and shine a light on it, to something much more complicated, much more diaphanous that takes place, in a sense, in a kind of a zone between the light and the chemicals and the imagination of the photographer. And I just want to, there's just a few images of Susan Rankaitis that I want to show you, and then we'll open it up. These images, again, I've known Susan's work since I first included her in an anthology called The Antiquarian Avant-Garde, where I was interested in her affiliations with 19th century attitudes toward photography, which involved the connections between painting and photography, where images were often painted on or altered in a variety of ways, and the photograph itself was not sacrosanct. It was considered only a starting point by many of those artists. And Susan struck me as very much in that mode, someone who did not see an opposition or did not see any clear opposition between painting and photography, but saw it all in terms of sort of making images. And those images very often had to do with her preoccupations with contemporary science. This is an early work of hers called the Icon series. This is a work that was done, as you say, that had to do with microfilm, right? Okay, and it's from a series called the...
I was working in a science lab called the Plato Laboratory.
Right.
And oftentimes they were trying to develop the first plasma display panel. And oftentimes a lot of the experiments which were about to be thrown away I would see as fodder. And at this point in time when I was doing these, I considered them like working sketches made photographically for my larger paintings.
And then a series of more, I would call them more sort of quasi, or they're political works almost, and this is called, the title of this is?
Two Black Planes.
Two Black Planes. And very large-scale pieces in which we have a combination, almost a palimpsest combination of sort of photographs that are wanting to be born, I would say, out of a more sort of chaotic kind of chemical reality. So there are aspects of photograms in here. There is sort of painting with emulsion. There's an injection of sort of handwork. But there's also, I mean, again, it's a hovering piece that does not allow us not only to understand its meaning, but I think to rest comfortably with the nature of the thing that it is. And well, in just 1 second, and we'll get to this notion of where sort of science figures into this, or where the imagination of science or contemporary science figures into this. But I just want to get a sense of sort of the complexity that's involved in these surfaces. And then they can take a different form. This is a sculpture that is essentially got a kind of photographic base, or at least it feels like a photograph, or in its presence. In the sculptural presence, we can say that we are having a photographic experience that has to do with the surface, but also, of course, an experience of many other things as well, including everything that goes with a nose cone like this. And then a more recent series that seems to engage biology much more aggressively and much more minutely, shall we say, at the microscopic level. And then I'll just leave you with a couple of images, and then we'll open it up. This is an image that I just saw in Venice that I've seen before, but very infrequently. This is a slow film by Tony Conrad that was shown in Venice. And it's not really a photograph at all. It's a movie. And the movie is an emulsion that Tony Conrad painted on a piece of paper, I don't know, 30 or almost 40 years ago, that periodically gets brought out, and every time it's exposed to light and sits there, it starts to change. So for him, the photograph is not a static thing at all. It's much more active. It's temporally much more complicated in the sense that it's not a moment in time, but it's a movie. It's much longer and you know, arguably as long as the paper will last. And finally, in a sense, I want to leave you with this quote, and then we'll move on. One of the things I think that all these images do is force us or solicit us to stop, in a sense, consuming images, at least in the conventional sense that we usually consume them. That is to say, read them quickly, identify them as rapidly as possible, and move on. And that kind of tide of images that have been written about for 50 years or more is one of the things, in a sense, that at the end of chemical photography, or perhaps at the end of photography, the last photographs, photographers are taking up again, and that is the speed of images and the ways in which we engage them. And I'm not saying they're fighting a rearguard action, but it's very much a part of their concerns. And so we have this quote from Nietzsche, who's writing about philology, and I think it could apply, I think, very much to the artists who are sitting next to me. This art does not so easily get anything done. It teaches to read well, that is, to read slowly, deeply, looking cautiously before and aft, with reservation, with doors left open, with delicate eyes and fingers. And it's from one of Nietzsche's most lyrical books. So, having said that, and that's a long preamble to our tale, but I have a couple of questions that I want to ask right away, if that's okay, unless you guys want to jump in and ask.
I want to jump into why there are no first paintings. For those of you who don't know my work, my background actually is in painting. And when I was 24 years old, I thought I would be a painter for the rest of my life, and still consider myself to be somewhat of a painter. But most of the painters I know are people who did drawings and paintings from about the age of 4 or 5, and essentially have drawn and painted their entire lives. And so, you know, unless they kept something, or their parents kept something that they did for, 4 years old, the process of becoming a painter is something that takes years and years and years and years. Whereas I think oftentimes when people of my generation did photography, they did it in a classroom situation, and they're very good photography teachers, and they would do a first photogram or a first print and always remember it, because that experience in the darkroom was so magic. And some of us have held on to a lot of our first things, but I think you have to differentiate between the process of learning how to paint and perhaps the process of studying photography in the 20th century.
Well, actually, I mean, I think that that kinds of sort of opens a door to sort of some fundamental differences in both how we make photographs, how we consume them, how we think about them, what they're there for, what they're often used for, that is, even by the people who make them. I'm not so interested in resurrecting, or not resurrecting, but in pursuing the opposition between painting and photography, because I think, in a sense, what we're really talking about, or what I'd like to talk about, is the making of images. But again, the only first paintings that we ever talk about are cave paintings, and there are plenty of reasons why we can't even think of those as first paintings. But
isn't there I know that Gregory Batchkin talks about in his book Burning with Desire the myth of the Corinthian maid.
Yes.
Where a shadow is traced by a woman of her lover who's going off to war. And that becomes this obsession in the 18th century. Certain English painters are painting this myth of the Corinthian maid, which he sort of talks about as the first photograph.
Right. I mean, actually,
and also, I think Sugimoto talks about fossils as being the first photograph.
Right. And what we're talking about. So in this case, we're talking about the registration of light, or the registration of an image that somehow is beyond the human hand. That is to say, it's not necessary for a person to actually have to physically do something somehow for the image to register. And in a sense, that's why I think we can talk about, I mean, we can talk about Hiroshima if we want to talk about a particularly horrible set of abstract images. And in fact, and in the firebombing of Dresden, for example, where energy was sort of pasting the human form to a substrate, just like a photogram. And those kinds of abstractions that, in a sense, haunt us, but that we, in a sense, somehow, at least in my thinking, I can't divorce from kind of the production of photographic images. Anyway, that's not a good answer, but
but I think photography, I mean, if it's the idea of the last painting, I think the origins of photography is something that is people are constantly coming back to, or at least Batchkin comes back to, and there's like 5 or 6 or 10 or different, inventors of photography. So there's this, the idea of the first photograph is really less about who did it than, as he says, it's like this desire to create a kind of image. But from my way of thinking,
Right.
the photograph, as we popularly understand it, and in your book you talk about the kind of your dissatisfaction with, as you call it, the Dusseldorf school, but you could apply it to any kind of camera-based image, is that a certain kind of photography implies a lens on the front of a box, basically a camera obscura, camera lucida, this chamber that produces a kind of image. So in Fox Talbot, you have these 2 types of images. I don't know if you showed any lace pictures. I think you only showed lensed.
Yeah, there was a quick one that I just sort of skipped over.
Lens-based images, and I think one of the interesting things that Susan and I frequently do not make lens-based pictures, and that, to me, that tension between pictures that are made with cameras and pictures that are made with materials or shadows or materials on a photographic surface, to me, that's where the kind of break occurs, or interesting way of looking at photography. And not to say that lens-based pictures are, or pictures that are made with traces of light without lenses, or one is more important. But recently, there's been a kind of emphasis on lens-based pictures. So I think to me, it was fascinating to look at your book and see these kind of seeking out other sorts of image-making technologies, in addition to pictures made with cameras. But that's also, I also was interested to see the Stephen Shore photograph, because to bring that picture in, as he's one of the kind of most prominent practitioners of view camera photography, but to bring that into a discussion of an idea of abstraction, or I thought that was a really nice kind of counter to the other kinds of images that are basically, for want of a better word, photograms.
Well, this kind of leads to a question I wanted to ask George. When we talk about abstraction, or when you talk about abstraction in relation to photography, what you're thinking about it in at least 2 senses that I think are very compelling. One is one that I sort of alluded to earlier, which is the notion that the photograph is or at least lens-based photography, I suppose, is what we're talking about now, is by its nature a kind of abstracting process, that it was born with the desire, as Jim was saying, or the larger social imperative to catalog, to describe, to divide, to archive, and otherwise organize experience in ways that are fundamentally abstracting. That's one aspect of it. But more recently, you've been talking about what we might call a meta-abstraction, or another level of abstraction. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about this, because it gets us into political realms that I'd like to engage, maybe.
Well, maybe I could just take a step back. I mean, one of the daunting things about having agreed to be on this panel when I agreed was that I thought immediately, and it's become clear to me as I'm listening tonight, that on the one hand, I don't think and I'll just say I know what photography is, nor do I know what abstraction is, or nor do we have, let's just say, let's put it a different way and say that we have stable definitions of photography the way I think we might have of other mediums like painting. Because photography was one of those first media that complicates what a medium really is within modernity. And then abstraction is a whole other can of worms. I mean, how do we use that word? It's very much, I think, used differently depending on the critic, depending on the writer, depending on the thinker who's putting that word into place. So, I mean, one thing I've been thinking about as I've been listening to the discussion tonight is that, okay, so there was the idea that there could be something like a last painting, but there was that idea because of the understanding of abstraction that was reigning at that point in the 20th century. Abstraction was the kind of motor force to produce the very idea that one could bring a medium to an end. And it was this teleology, as you put it earlier, of a kind of reductionism, a kind of taking away. And so that made me wondering, why are we thinking about abstraction now in relationship to photography now? And what I was struck by, I've read your book, and everyone should read it. What I was struck by as I read your book was your whole narrative is the exact opposite of that. It's not about the reduction or the end or the last. Abstraction for you, so I'm turning the question around on you, I'm not going to answer what I think abstraction is. Abstraction for you seems to be the moment when an image is opened up, the moment when an image becomes something else. And the other thing that we hold over from debates about abstraction that had to do with painting and that had to do with modernism, one of the things I was thinking about before coming here tonight is that those debates were about something like self-definition. An abstract painting was a kind of a quest to understand what painting was in its essence, philosophically speaking, its ontology.
Right.
And we have some voices in the contemporary arena talking about photography who still want to use that language and still are concerned with those things. I'm thinking about Michael Fried, perhaps most of all. I mean, that there's some kind of ontological work that is happening in contemporary art around photography today. But I as a critic, my critical project, I found that to be very not helpful, and not a helpful way of thinking about what's happening with photography. That the only ontological project that photography has ever been involved with, and increasingly so today, is the undoing of a search for some kind of an essence of an image and of the medium.
Yeah.
And if so, that's something that abstraction is part of a process of not the self-definition, the self-reflexivity, the kind of autonomy and reduction of a form to its essence, but the opening up and the analogies and the connections that can occur when a form or an image betrays itself.
Yeah,
That's what I've been interested in.
Absolutely. I want to jump in here. I mean, I think it's from my perspective, maybe the central tenet that abstraction is an opening up. That is to say, it occupies part of a continuum of thinking about image making or of making images today, and it's not separate from the work that might be done with lens-based image making. I don't feel. That is to say, and it's not self-referential in that it is a reduction of photography to some essence. It's about the possibilities of photography. It's about every aspect of photography. And this is what artists are thinking about. They're thinking about the making of images, the designation of images as beautiful, the possibility of making an image, about who consumes them, about what happens to images once they get made, about the process by which images are made, about all those things. And every place that artists look, it strikes me, they have opened up aspects of image making. They have, I don't want to say revivified it, but to me they've made it much more interesting. The assumptions that had been, even from the notion of meaning itself, or the idea of a subject, that had concealed, I would say, so much about what we were actually experiencing, or what we do experience with images. And again, by images, I don't mean things that have a clear subject. That those are back in front of us. They are back on the table. They are things that, in a sense, we can, how shall we say, we don't have to be blind to, or we don't have to look through. The window, as in, when James makes an image of a curtain with stuff on it, it's actually phyllo dough. It's as if to say, the curtain has come down on the window of photography, and now it's time to look at the photographs. Instead of looking through the photograph to find something else out there that it is supposed to be, or that it's supposed to be about. Now, having said that, I just want to jump to a slightly different subject quickly, and it has to do with science, the interest that both of you have in science. When you wrote me earlier in the week, you were talking about how so many of your images really came out of very particular interests that you had in aspects of contemporary science. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that, because it's not usually the way people think of your work. It's certainly not the way I did initially.
Well, first I want to hire you for my publicist. But I think your reading, was the Borges reading was really very apt because I am interested in a kind of irony, and that's the way my work is sometimes looked at. But when we were emailing about this talk, I did want to bring up the idea that initially in the early 80s, I was interested in making a kind of photographic tableau that was closer to a kind of scientific modeling, or creating like a bubble chamber or some sort of event chamber where I could create something and then document it. So the idea of model.
Yeah, so
which
you're
is-
making models in a sense. you
Well,
thought.
but not in the way that Ellen Brooks or James Casebeer would make a model,
Right.
but the way a scientist would create the kind of elements of an experiment and then photograph the result. So it was always about photographing what had just taken place. So that event was not being photographed, but the residue of the event. And that, I think, I've made other works that don't maybe use that template so clearly, but when I first started making what I call abstract photographs, it was around this idea of making some sort of situation where an event would have taken place, and I would photograph the residue, the way a scientist would
Exactly.
document. And it's not that I'm have any deep interest in science, but to me it seemed like or I'm not a scientist or a mathematician, but it seemed like an interesting way of looking at recording from that perspective, rather than the other side that I encountered with street photography or reproducing the everyday. I was interested in this other more abstracting, the way a scientific experiment would take elements of an event and kind of boil it down.
And Susan, again, science figures so prominently in your work. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that's woven in, or how that sort of engages you imaginatively.
Oh, okay. It all comes together, I think, pretty much at the beginning of my work, whereby I've never been able to separate form and process and content, from the very beginning of my work. And I always was interested in many different things, as most of us are, but one of them was science. And I think the great thing about being an artist, at least at this point in time, is one can make work about anything. And to me, the most interesting questions, things that I really want to think about and understand, are really coming out of contemporary science research. And it started out with issues of bioethics and genetics, although I had, as I said, worked in a computer research lab. I was interested in science as a kid and, entered science fairs and things like that. But when I went to college, there wasn't really the opportunity to do two things, and I really loved art. But I think that, for me, art is a way of kind of figuring out things, and even abstractly kind of dealing with and trying to understand some of what I think are the most interesting questions, of our time, of our generation. And I think, for me, they're happening in biology. Certainly they're happening in neuroscience right now. And as an artist, I find this an incredibly tough learning curve. And there are people now who are both artists and scientists. I am an artist who has a strong interest in science as an avocation. And I'm not in any way trying to necessarily illustrate science, but kind of speculate on some of these incredible things that are happening in terms of what we're beginning to understand about the brain, about fear, about intuition, things that I was interested in before. But and I still find connecting my own body, in the darkroom, drawing, doing the physical process of making work, which I'm pretty addicted to, the best template through which I can kind of think about these things and work on them. And so I just find that it's what I find most fascinating. And I've done collaborations with scientists because it's such an incredibly difficult field. But I find it compelling, and I feel like that I look at everything in life kind of through that template of neuroscience right now and what we're learning about our own minds.
George, anything?
I don't think about science very often.
I have to say I think about it a lot, but I think about it perhaps the way an artist might think about it or a photographer might think about it. And this gets back to, again, back to Fox Talbot, and earlier I kind of called James our Fox Talbot. Maybe I revised that a little bit, but I just want to say one more thing. And that is that a person like Fox Talbot, who was a linguist, a sometime chemist, or at least had an interest in chemistry, a curious person, an entrepreneur, was also someone, I think, who was not so much interested in scientific breakthroughs per se, but at least through his work, in creating another kind of description of the world based in science or motivated by the kind of curiosity of a scientist. And I'm thinking about James's expression, or Jim's expression about modeling. And there's something fundamental, I think, right there about where we see photography moving. The notion that photography gives us some sort of direct umbilical connection to the world, it seems to be as being replaced by a very different kind of modeling, where photographs are offered to us, at least in part, as something that looks like a real thing, looks like a truth, and yet at the same time is set aside. Very much an additional, or I don't want to say a critical description of reality, but something that can't simply be subsumed by the thing that it is supposedly connected to, by that larger world. It is a parallel description of reality, or it is a close description of reality. And that, in a sense, is sort of where, if I think about Fox Talbot, that's perhaps where, at some point, he came down in his thinking about photographs in this ambiguous place. I don't know. I think we should
open up to questions.
We should open it up. Yeah. So, questions
From the audience.
from the audience.
There's some mics. Mics are going to come down.
If you can just wait for the microphone, raise your hand, someone will bring it around to you. Thank you.
So, question in the front.
I'm going to get all nervous. Okay, so do you think with the other arts, like with painting and sculpture, that because of their materiality, that they can be reduced in a way that a photograph can't be reduced? Like a photograph always has that sense of talking about something through something else, whereas there's something kind of more essentialist about painting and sculpture? Or do you think that that in a way painting and sculpture can have that sort of irreducible quality, but somehow the sense of abstraction has been eliminated from the conversation about them as well? If that makes sense. Sorry.
That's a question for any of us.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm still thinking about that.
Oh, okay.
I mean, my answer to it would be that I think that for a long time, many people had the fantasy or the illusion that painting and sculpture could be reduced in that way. But very few people thought that or attempted to think photography in those same terms. I mean, I don't think that painting is just about the flatness of a canvas surface. And obviously, I don't think many artists think about painting that way anymore either. But there were very few attempts to think that way about photography because I think of the compound nature of the apparatus. I mean, is it the camera? Is it the emulsion? Is it the paper? Is it the light? I mean, what makes a photograph, if you're talking about its materiality as a medium, becomes even right from the very start, in traditional approaches to photography and historical approaches to photography, I think already a very fraught and complex question. And when that attempt was made, say, by someone like Clement Greenberg, the answers even someone like he would come up with, I think, weren't satisfying to many people. So what was the essence of a photograph for Clement Greenberg? It was to depict things. It was to make pictures. What painting was no longer going to do. Painting was no longer going to depict, so that was the arena left to the photograph. And so this whole notion of pictures and picturing, the whole Jeff Wall sort of thinking about photography in the last few decades is very indebted to that older attempt to define the essence of photography. But I think it failed on both accounts in terms of painting, sculpture, and in terms of the technological media like photography and like cinema. That's how I would answer that question. But it also, I think, begins to raise issues as to why one would want to think about abstraction in terms of photography, because that was precisely how those modernists who thought they could define the essence of photography that's precisely what they were outlining in photographic terms. So someone like Clement Greenberg would not appreciate Aaron Siskind, for example,
Right.
because he was not following what was in fact the essential task of the photograph, or the essential nature of the photograph as a medium to depict. But Walker Evans perhaps would be closer, or whomever else one might want to insert there.
Yes.
Can you wait for the microphone, please?
In using the term abstract or abstraction, and as was loosely defined,
Very loosely, I have to say.
would you roll in to any of the panelists? Does that include conceptual art in the traditional sense of a Solowit kind of thing, or does it not include conceptual art?
Anybody want to jump in? I got some.
I think at least two of us sitting up here are conceptual artists of sorts, and this kind of relates to the first question too. I think that art is always kind of transforming and reinventing itself, and one of the reasons that I have a little bit of a difficult time with these questions is that so many artists working now actually are not necessarily medium specific, and that artists work in a lot of different fields, and and certainly I think one can deal with do some abstract work that can be somewhat conceptual in nature, although not maybe traditionally conceptual in the way that you mentioned it. But I think that so many boundaries have kind of fused and crossed and continue to be, and to me that's the really significant thing about working now, and I think it's one of the really interesting things. And I think rather than trying to necessarily reduce things in any way, I actually like the kind of expansionism that's going on across media and across disciplines and across fields. And I guess I don't see any end game, because I see all these new trajectories beginning to occur. So.
Just picking up on your mention of Solowit and the idea that George had, that for Greenberg the only appropriate photograph would be a depiction. Solowit's photographic work, sunsets or photographs of his apartment, or someone like Dan Graham, or following in Jeff Wall's essay, The De-Skilling of Photography. I mean, the conceptualists used photography, ironically, just the way Greenberg would want them to, as a straightforward recording device. So, just following on what we've heard, they would not be working abstractly at all. It would be the complete opposite.
Except for Mel Bachner.
Is then a leaping off point for more conceptual work or work in different mediums?
Well, the conceptualists didn't want to do anything arty. They wanted to do just, dumb, straightforward recording with photography, and it was a big breakthrough to get away from the artiness that someone like Minor White or the F-64 group or various new subjectivity in photography in the 50s. It was like, get rid of all that crap and just do what photography is good at, depict things.
Only the facts, man.
So it's like there's this oscillation in the history of photography. So unfortunately, someone like people who misread Jeff Wall's writings might think that that's the only thing that photography can do, which is follow on this Greenbergian idea. And I think what Lyle has done is, in his book, is like point out that, hey, there's other ways of working with the photograph.
Well, not only that, I just want to inject, those Mel Bachner pictures are really, really seminal for me, because they give us a snapshot of a conceptual artist who ran into photography. Very much the way, if you look at Degas' experiments with photography, a painter who runs into photography and really takes it seriously, doesn't quite know what to do with it, but suddenly finds that he's in way over his head. And to some degree, Bachner ran into the same issues and really liked to play with them. I mean, that was conceptual art, very definitely, and he was interested in the documentary quality of those photographs. But what he was trying to get at was how much kind of fell between the cracks in any documentary approach. And you can see him become completely obsessed with what, in a very little box, what photographs can do. And I mean, that's the kind of experience that, for a writer, I'm always looking for. Where, and I mean, you see it in Jim's work all the time, where he sets up a series of conditions. He has an idea or an approach, or call it whatever you want, and he signs on and he ships out. And where he actually winds up is very different, perhaps, from what he would have imagined beforehand. Never prescripted, never fully imagined. And that those possibilities, and those are emotional, those are aesthetic, if you want to call it that, they're all kinds of things, are kind of where the juice is in photography. I mean, there can be a concept, but the concept is not, it's not a documentary one. It's a set of conditions. It's an exploration, you might say.
Mr. Welling, can we put your photographs back up on the screen, and could you sort of describe what you were trying to achieve in each of them?
Yeah. Uh-oh.
No thanks.
I'll put them up, but
I am, you know, I'm 50% ironic. The other thing is, you know, I'm interested in uncanny pictures, and one of the great expressions in Lyle's book, and I can't really remember it, where you talk about photographs that quote each other. There's an idea of making a representation that's, you know, about the idea of representation. So that, you know, one of the things that I like to do is to make work that is, you know, mimics photographs. So in my earliest abstract photographs, I was interested in, to some extent, 50% of the time, being ironic about people like Minor White, whose work was a kind of, you know, spiritual activity in photography. But of course, the other 50% of me thinks that's a really interesting thing to do, to believe that. So I'm, you know, a believing unbeliever.
the apostate.
But, you know, this is not, I don't think, you know, I'm unique in this. I think a lot of photographers, they, you know, even people like Gary Winograd, you know, when he was asked, you know, why he takes pictures, because he wants to see how things look in photographs. You know, and there's this relationship of, and partly because the camera is a mechanical device, there's this, you know, going back and forth, transiting back and forth between did I do it or did the camera do it? And so there's this fascination. And again, you know, to quote Lyle, my publicist, but he talks about...
I'm charging you for this, actually.
Moholy-Nagy, a great quote that I wasn't familiar with, where Moholy-Nagy talks about, what is it, eyes outside of the body?
Yeah, eyes outside our bodies.
Yeah, and so that the idea of the photogram, or you could look at it as this extended view of photography as eyes outside the body, I think is a really great metaphor for the kind of work that, you know, Lyle's looking at.
And, you know, we can go back to that little tiny image of, I had to go back to Fox Talbot again, but that little tiny image of Fox Talbot that's got a kind of a curved shape to it, and that was a mousetrap picture. That was so called. It was called that by his wife, and it was because he was making a pinhole camera, which is like stuff we do when we're kids, and it's just a box with a pinhole in it that captures light, and it will refract it and make an image. And he had little boxes that he put all over his lawn, you know, just to see what things would look like, see if they could actually capture light and make an image. And when they came out, his wife said, oh, that's obvious what that is. That's exactly how the world would look like to a mouse. Not to a human being, not to a camera, but to a mouse. And I always like that. That's kind of my counterpart to the eyes outside our bodies. You know, it's sort of like, it's a mouse out there. And obviously there's an enormous aspect of this kind of mousetrap vision, I would call it, to our, I think to all our experiences with the photographs that we really care about.
In the digital age that we're now so involved with in photography, and in many instances getting away from the emulsion, how do you see that, the contrast between those two aspects?
Speed. That's my easy answer, speed. And I'll just leave it at that, but George?
I'm just unsure. The contrast between what? Between?
Well, in all of, my early experience with photography, of course, was everything was on an emulsion. And today, so many people have gotten away from the darkroom, so to speak, and digitizing. They may be taking an image with a camera, but the representation of that image, once they get to their creation, is so far removed from the optical image that was captured on the digital format. And I'm wondering how you see utilizing, instead of the emulsion, using the digital capability.
Well, that's something that the book doesn't go into, and I was talking to Lyle. I guess I wasn't talking to you about this. I was talking to someone else today about it, and I'm very interested in artists who are using inkjet printers as a kind of hybrid. People like Josh Smith and Wayne Guyton, who are using inkjet printers as a kind of almost like a painting tool, who are scanning and doing things with inkjet and pigment. And that seems like a really fruitful thing to do. But it's like beyond the scope of the book, which, as you were describing earlier, that the book ends at a certain point. But to me, that would be an interest, a spot where the trajectory of your text, to me, would lead toward these younger artists who are working with inkjet.
Yeah, I mean, I would go a lot further than that. I mean, I would say that this book is already an artifact. I mean, it is an artifact anyway, but and if we were going to think about this stuff now, there'd be a lot more about the internet in this book, a whole lot more about digital photography and its implications for the kinds of things that we're talking about here. Because it almost feels like, I mean, when we talk photographs, we almost feel like fossils already. At least I feel like a fossil already. And that's not pejoratively intended to our panelists who are artists, but when I think about the way so many people are using images, whatever they are, and their ultimate reality has absolutely no meaning, that is where they came from originally or anything, or what they're of. When I think about the way people are actually using those images, it just seems like, again, I like the idea that we're slowing things down, but the internet and digital image making or digital image consumption is all about speed. It's all about the absolute ability to become a kind of bodiless viewer, and to organize or to fail to organize one's experience visually at a level that's literally inconceivable before now. And yeah, I mean, we're still trying to sort that out, but that seems to me to where all the pressure is coming from. I mean, in a sense, photography is, again, this kind of slow, much more patient, and I'm not just talking about chemical photography, but the idea of the single image as somehow the bearer of something is just, wow. I mean, it's something that we have to reckon with, but it is seriously under pressure, and the world that's taking shape is not about those images, I don't think.
I think in the original question there was the implication that, and I would agree with this if I heard you right, that I mean, there's, with the sheer technological shift from emulsion to the digital, there's something that pushes you towards the abstract, and maybe you're also saying this.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, that I don't think we would be here talking about this topic after the debates on abstraction that characterize modernism if it wasn't in some sense because of the nature of this technological shift, even if we're not basing our discussion there. I just think that the very nature of the fact that the photographic image is not ontologically thought to be tied to the indexical, the real, the object that the light was reflected from, that the digital is itself already a process of mediation. I mean, what it's led me to think about, and some of the things I've written about photography in the last few years, I mean, I've, gone to the point of describing certain photographs that, stylistically speaking, would be called documentary as abstract photographs. Because I'm not trying to use the term abstract in my own writing as a stylistic term. We didn't
Right.
talk about this so much yet, but it
Yeah,
used
we
to be a
didn't.
stylistic term, and I wonder how the artists on the panel use the word, if they use it in their work. But in my work as a critic, I've been using the word abstract not as a stylistic term, but as a kind of social historical condition. And under that definition, an image that is no longer tied to the real, even if it might look like a documentary image, but that has been manipulated in so many ways, is already involved in a kind of condition of abstraction, at least as I would see it. So that's definitely tied, I think, to this moment of digitalization, at the very root, and has brought up the issue of abstraction in a whole range of new ways that we couldn't have imagined, I think, before this.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, Thomas Struth's pictures of the JPEGs seem to me to be, Thomas Roof's, I'm sorry. My German is failing me. Thomas Roof's pictures of the JPEGs seem to me seminal in that regard, or absolutely kind of, as usual, his thumb is right on what's going on. And they may seem a little obvious to all of you, but they have meaning precisely because they are what image making is contending with, or is in a sense, all about. And they also have an enormous amount of resonance too, I think.
I feel like that question is a question that is worthy of a whole nother evening, and it's one of the most interesting questions to me right now. But I think we need to wrap this up, and I want you all to join us in the bookstore for a book signing, and you can ask more questions of our panelists. And I'd like to thank them so much. This has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.